March 1943. The North Atlantic becomes a graveyard. Every 8 hours, another Allied merchant ship disappears beneath black waves, torpedoed by German submarines that hunt in coordinated wolf packs. The statistics are brutal. For every 10 supply vessels that leave New York Harbor bound for Britain, 3 never arrive. The cargo they carry, food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, sinks with them. In London, military strategists calculate that Britain has 4 months of reserves remaining, 4 months before the island nation starves or surrenders. The Royal Navy's destroyers and corvettes race frantically across convoy routes, dropping depth charges, but the U-boats are faster, more maneuverable, disappearing into the depths before Allied ships can respond. The technology gap is simple and devastating. German submarines accelerate from 0 to 17 knots in 45 seconds. British destroyers take 3 minutes to reach pursuit speed. Those 2 minutes and 15 seconds mean the difference between a successful depth charge attack and watching a periscope vanish into the Atlantic murk. Admiral Ernest King stands in the War Department building in Washington, his weathered hands pressed against a table covered with maritime charts. Red pins mark known U-boat attacks. There are so many pins the Atlantic Ocean appears to bleed. His voice is hoarse when he speaks to the assembled naval engineers. "We are losing this war 1 merchant ship at a time," he says. "We need our vessels to respond faster. We need engine efficiency that doesn't exist." The engineers exchange uncomfortable glances. They've tried everything. Larger propellers damage hull integrity. More powerful engines require fuel reserves that reduce cargo capacity. Streamlined hull designs take 18 months to implement per vessel. There are no solutions that work within the laws of physics and the constraints of wartime manufacturing. If you want to see how an ordinary kid changed the course of the war, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Philadelphia Navy Yard sprawls across the Delaware River waterfront, a maze of dry docks, machine shops, and fabrication facilities that operate 24 hours daily. The air tastes like metal shavings and coal smoke. Workers move between buildings in purposeful streams, their faces shadowed by fatigue. Most have been pulling double shifts for 2 years straight. Bernard Kowalski works as a junior machinist in Building 17, operating a lathe that shapes brass fittings for destroyer rudder assemblies. He's 38 years old, Polish immigrant, came to America in 1927 with his wife Anna and built a life around precision metalwork. His hands are scarred from a decade of manufacturing, small burns and cuts that come with the trade. He's good at his job, respected by foremen, never misses a deadline. His son Thomas is 12 years old, skinny kid with dark hair and curious eyes that notice everything. The boy spends afternoons after school at the Navy Yard, sitting in the corner of his father's workshop doing homework while machines roar around him. The supervisors tolerate Thomas's presence because Bernard is reliable and because the kid never causes trouble. Thomas likes the Navy Yard. He likes watching metal transform under his father's skilled hands, raw stock becoming engineered components that serve specific purposes. He asks questions constantly. Why does brass machine differently than steel? What determines the optimal thread pitch for a bolt under marine stress? His father answers patiently, explaining principles of metallurgy and mechanical engineering in simple terms. The boy absorbs everything. One afternoon in late March, Thomas sits on a wooden stool near his father's workstation, geometry textbook open on his lap. He's supposed to be calculating triangle areas, but he's watching Bernard instead, observing how his father adjusts the lathe speed when working with different materials. A group of naval engineers walks through Building 17, clipboards in hand, inspecting production quotas. Their conversation carries across the workshop floor. The lead engineer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Howard Mitchell, is explaining a technical problem to his colleagues. The issue is engine response time. On Fletcher-class destroyers, he says. Current turbine systems require 170 seconds to reach maximum power output from idle. We need that number under 90 seconds to effectively pursue U-boat contacts. But increasing steam pressure beyond current parameters risks boiler rupture. We're caught between engineering constraints that appear mutually exclusive. Thomas listens, head tilted slightly. He doesn't understand all the terminology, but he grasps the core problem. Ships need to go fast quickly, but the engines can't handle the stress. It's a materials problem, he thinks. Like when his father explained why you can't just make bolts tighter, you need the right metal at the right thickness. The engineers move on, still talking, voices fading into the general noise of the workshop. Thomas returns to his geometry homework, but the problem stays in his mind, turning over like a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit. That evening at dinner, Thomas asks his father about steam engines. The Kowalski family lives in a narrow brick row house in South Philadelphia, 3 blocks from the Navy Yard. The kitchen is small and warm, windows fogged from cooking. Anna serves pierogi and kielbasa, while Bernard explains how marine turbines work, using salt and pepper shakers to demonstrate the relationship between steam pressure and propeller rotation. Your engine is like a runner, Bernard says. A runner can sprint very fast but needs time to accelerate. The question is, how do you make the acceleration faster without breaking the runner's legs? Thomas nods slowly. What if you don't make the runner faster, he says. What if you remove the weight he's carrying? Bernard pauses, fork halfway to his mouth. Go on, he says. Well, Thomas continues, if the problem is the engine takes too long to power up, maybe the problem isn't the engine. Maybe it's something else that's slowing down the ship, like friction or something. Bernard sets down his fork. Friction, he repeats. Thomas, the engineers have been working on hull design for years. They've smoothed every surface, optimized every curve. There's not much more to do there, but Thomas isn't satisfied. He's thinking about his bicycle, how sometimes the chain doesn't run smooth even when it's oiled, how there are little catches and hesitations that waste energy. There's always something, he insists, something small that people don't notice. The next day after school, Thomas doesn't go directly to Building 17. Instead, he walks along the waterfront, where destroyers sit in dry dock, massive grey hulls suspended above ground on wooden supports. The afternoon sun casts long shadows across the yard, and the air smells like fresh paint and hot metal. Workers move purposefully around the ships, their voices echoing off steel plates. He wants to see these ships up close, understand their construction in a way that blueprints can't convey. A security guard stops him at the gate, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and suspicious eyes. "Kid, you can't be here," the guard says. "This is a restricted area." Thomas explains his father works here, shows his visitor pass that Bernard got him months ago. The guard examines the pass carefully, reads Bernard's name and employee number. "Kowalski," he says. "Building 17, right? Good man, your father. Always on time. Never complains." He waves Thomas through with a warning to stay clear of active work zones, away from cranes and welding operations. Thomas promises to be careful and walks into the shipyard proper, feeling small beneath the towering hulls. Thomas walks slowly beneath a destroyer's hull, craning his neck to examine the underside. The ship is enormous from this angle, a city of metal suspended impossibly above him. The propeller assembly is massive, bronze blades as tall as a man, each blade precisely curved to move water with maximum efficiency. He traces the drive shaft with his eyes, following it from the propeller housing back toward the engine compartment, where steam turbines will eventually transform pressure into rotation. The shaft is thick steel, maybe 8 inches in diameter, supported at intervals by bearing assemblies that look like large metal collars wrapped around the shaft. These bearings are critical components, Thomas realizes. They keep the shaft aligned while allowing it to spin at hundreds of revolutions per minute. Any misalignment would create catastrophic vibration, tear the ship apart from the inside. Thomas finds a scaffold ladder and climbs carefully, testing each rung before putting his weight on it. A welder working 20 feet away on the hull plating looks over and shouts, "Hey kid, you authorized to be up there?" Thomas shows his visitor pass, and the welder shrugs, returns to his work, electric arc throwing brilliant blue-white light. Thomas moves cautiously along the scaffold platform, keeping one hand on the safety rail, working his way closer to the nearest bearing assembly. Up close, the engineering becomes clearer. The shaft runs through the bearing housing, and there's a precisely calibrated gap between the shaft surface and the housing interior, perhaps a 1/16 of an inch, filled with thick, lubricating grease that prevents metal-on-metal contact while allowing smooth rotation. Makes sense, Thomas thinks. The shaft needs to spin freely without friction that would waste energy and generate heat. But there's also a series of metal clips around the bearing housing. Small, semicircular pieces that wrap partway around the circumference, held in place with bolts. Thomas doesn't know what they're called. There's no label, but he can see their function clearly. They keep the bearing assembly aligned with the shaft, prevent lateral movement that would create vibration, act as safety restraints in case the bearing itself shifts under stress. He counts them carefully, running his finger along the assembly without touching, just tracing the air. 8 clips per bearing housing, evenly spaced around the circumference. 4 bearing assemblies per shaft, 1 near the propeller, 1 near the engine, 2 in between. 32 clips total just for this one drive shaft, and the ship probably has multiple shafts. Each clip is held by 4 bolts, serious fastening meant to withstand the violent forces of the ocean. He examines one clip closely, noting how it's constructed. The clip is thick, maybe a 1/4 inch of solid steel, heavy-duty construction designed to withstand marine stress and saltwater corrosion over years of service. The metal is clean now, freshly machined, but Thomas can imagine how it will look after months at sea, oxidized and encrusted with salt, bearing the weight of the ocean's relentless assault. Thomas climbs down from the scaffold and finds a quiet corner of the yard where he can think. He pulls out a notebook where he sketches machinery sometimes, starts drawing the bearing assembly from memory. The clips are functional, but they're also heavy. 32 clips, each one adding weight. Not much individually, but collectively, maybe 20 or 30 pounds of steel that serves a stabilization function, but doesn't need to be solid metal. It could be lighter. It should be lighter. Every pound on a ship is a pound the engine has to move. He thinks about his father's explanation of acceleration, how removing weight from a runner makes them faster. These clips aren't the engine and they aren't the hull. They're in between, part of the drive system that nobody's really questioned because they work fine. They're just heavier than they need to be. Thomas spends the next hour in the Navy Yard Library, a small room in the administration building where technical manuals are stored. He finds a manual on destroyer propulsion systems and pages through it carefully, looking for specifications on bearing assemblies. The diagrams confirm what he observed. The clips are specified as solid steel, 1/4 inch thickness, designed for maximum durability. But there's a note in the margin of one page, added by hand in pencil, probably by an engineer. Note: clip failure rate less than 0.1% over vessel lifetime, exceeds safety margins by factor of 4. Thomas reads that line 3 times. The clips are over-engineered, built stronger than necessary because the engineers wanted absolutely no risk of failure, which makes sense for a critical component, but it also means there's room for weight reduction without compromising safety. That evening, Thomas explains his idea to his father over dinner. "Dad," he says, "what if the bearing clips on the drive shafts were made from lighter material, not weaker, just not solid steel? Maybe hollow, or maybe a different alloy." Bernard listens carefully, doesn't dismiss the idea immediately, which Thomas appreciates. His father takes engineering seriously, even when it comes from a 12-year-old. It's an interesting thought, Bernard says slowly. But those clips are specified by naval architects who've calculated stress loads and safety factors. Changing them would require approval from the Bureau of Ships, testing, documentation. It's not simple. I know, Thomas says. But what if it worked? What if you could reduce ship weight by 50 pounds without weakening anything? 50 pounds doesn't sound like much, but it's 50 pounds that the engine doesn't have to accelerate. That's like, I don't know, a fraction of a second saved in response time. Bernard sets down his coffee cup. You're thinking correctly, he says. Weight reduction does improve acceleration, and cumulative small improvements can add up. But Thomas, the Navy has hundreds of engineers working on these problems. If there was an easy solution, they'd have found it. Thomas nods, but he's not convinced. Sometimes the easy solutions are the ones people overlook because they're too focused on big changes. Bigger engines, better fuel, redesigned hulls. Nobody's looking at the little clips that nobody thinks about. The following Saturday, Thomas goes to a scrapyard near the Navy Yard. He has $2.30 saved from helping neighbors with yard work, and he wants to test his idea. He finds a pile of discarded metal stock and buys several pieces: a solid steel rod, a hollow steel tube, and a piece of aluminum alloy. The scrapyard owner gives him a strange look, but takes his money. Back at home, Thomas sets up a workspace in the basement. His father lets him use some basic tools: a hacksaw, file, and calipers. Thomas cuts each material into identical clip shapes, matching the dimensions from the technical manual he memorized. Then he weighs each piece on his mother's kitchen scale, recording the numbers carefully. The solid steel clip weighs 4.3 ounces. The hollow steel tube clip weighs 2.7 ounces. The aluminum alloy clip weighs 1.6 ounces. He does the math in his notebook. 32 clips per ship. If you replaced solid steel with hollow steel, you'd save 51 ounces, just over 3 pounds. If you used aluminum alloy, you'd save 86 ounces, almost 5.5 pounds. It doesn't sound like much. Thomas stares at his numbers, feeling discouraged. 5 pounds won't change acceleration time noticeably. His idea is too small, too insignificant. But then he thinks about something his father once told him. In precision machinery, every component matters. You can't just improve one thing. You have to improve everything, layer by layer, until the cumulative effect becomes significant. Monday afternoon, Thomas sits in the corner of Building 17 doing homework while his father works. But he's also watching the other machinists, observing what they make. Rudder fittings, propeller housings, pump assemblies, valve mechanisms. Hundreds of components, each one machined to exact specifications, each one made from materials chosen for durability and strength. Each one potentially heavier than it needs to be because the specifications prioritize reliability over weight. Thomas starts making a list in his notebook, components that could potentially be lightened without compromising function. He doesn't know if he's right about any of them, but he's starting to see a pattern. The Navy's ships are built like fortresses, every part overbuilt, because failure at sea means death. But overbuilding means weight, and weight means slow acceleration, and slow acceleration means U-boats escape. There's a balance point somewhere, where components are strong enough but not heavier than necessary. Finding that balance might save lives. Thomas decides he needs to talk to someone who understands engineering better than he does. His father is skilled, but Bernard works from specifications, doesn't design components himself. Thomas needs a designer, someone who makes decisions about materials and dimensions. He finds Howard Mitchell in Building 23 on a Tuesday afternoon. The naval engineer is reviewing blueprints with a group of contractors, and Thomas waits patiently until the meeting ends. When Mitchell walks past, Thomas steps forward nervously. "Excuse me, sir," he says. "Mr. Mitchell, The engineer stops, looks down at this skinny kid in worn clothes. Yes? Can I help you? Thomas takes a breath. My name is Thomas Kowalski. My dad works in Building 17. I've been thinking about the acceleration problem you mentioned last week, the one about destroyers needing to reach pursuit speed faster. Mitchell's eyebrows rise slightly. You were listening to that? Thomas nods. I had an idea, he says quickly, before he loses courage. It's probably stupid, but I wanted to ask you about it. I was thinking about the bearing clips on the propeller drive shafts and how they're made from solid steel, and I looked at the failure rates in the technical manual and they're way below the safety threshold, so I wondered if you could make them lighter, like hollow or aluminum, and I know it's only a few pounds, but I thought maybe if you did that to a lot of components, the cumulative weight reduction might help with acceleration time. He runs out of breath and stops, face flushed. Mitchell is staring at him. There's a long silence. Finally, the engineer says, "How old are you?" 12, sir, Thomas says. Mitchell rubs his jaw slowly. Come with me, he says. They walk to Mitchell's office, a cramped room filled with blueprints and technical references. Mitchell pulls out a binder labeled Fletcher Class Technical Specifications and flips through pages until he finds the section on drive shaft assemblies. He studies the specifications for the bearing clips, reading the notes in the margins. Then he sits back in his chair and looks at Thomas. You're right, he says quietly. These clips are over-specified by a significant margin. We could reduce material thickness by 30% without compromising structural integrity. Thomas feels his heart beating fast. So, it would work? Mitchell holds up a hand. It would save weight, yes. But Thomas, we're talking about maybe 6 or 7 pounds total per vessel. That translates to a negligible improvement in acceleration, maybe a fraction of a second. It's not enough to solve the problem. Thomas nods, disappointed, but not surprised. But what if it wasn't just the clips, he says. What if you looked at every component the same way, found all the places where parts are heavier than they need to be? Mitchell taps his fingers on the desk. That's called weight optimization, he says. And yes, in theory, comprehensive weight reduction across all ship systems could yield significant performance improvements. But it would require reviewing thousands of components, redesigning specifications, retooling manufacturing processes. It's a massive undertaking, too massive for wartime production, Thomas says, understanding. Mitchell nods. Exactly. We don't have time for a complete overhaul. We need solutions that can be implemented quickly, within weeks, not months. Thomas thinks about this. Then what if you just focused on the components that are easiest to change, the ones that don't require new tools or complicated redesigns? Mitchell leans forward, interested now. Go on. Well, Thomas says, the bearing clips are basically just curved metal pieces held by bolts. You could make them from different material or make them hollow, and you wouldn't need to change anything else. Same dimensions, same installation, just lighter. And maybe there are other parts like that, simple components that could be swapped out without affecting the rest of the system. Mitchell is quiet for a moment. Then he stands up and walks to a filing cabinet, pulls out another binder. This one is labeled Weight Reduction Studies, April 1942. He flips it open, shows Thomas pages of calculations and proposals. We did a comprehensive analysis last year, he says. Identified 43 components across destroyer systems that could potentially be lightened. But the Bureau of Ships rejected the proposal because the projected weight savings was only 820 pounds per vessel, which they deemed insufficient to justify the manufacturing changes. Thomas looks at the numbers. 820 pounds is a lot, he says. Mitchell shakes his head. Not in naval engineering. A Fletcher-class destroyer displaces 2,000 tons. 800 pounds is 0.04% of total displacement. The acceleration improvement would be maybe 1 second, perhaps 2. The Bureau calculated it wasn't worth the effort. But, Thomas says slowly, if you're only talking about changing simple components that don't require retooling, what's the effort? It's just using different materials for parts you're already making. Mitchell pauses. That's actually a fair point, he admits. The reason we shelved the proposal was because we assumed implementation would be complex and expensive. But if we're only talking about substituting lighter materials in existing manufacturing processes, the cost would be minimal. Howard Mitchell sits down and reviews the weight reduction study more carefully. He's quiet for several minutes, making notes on a pad of paper. Thomas waits, not wanting to interrupt. Finally, Mitchell looks up. Thomas, he says, you might have stumbled onto something here. Not because your specific idea about bearing clips is revolutionary, but because you're asking the right question. We've been so focused on major engineering breakthroughs that we've ignored incremental improvements that could be implemented immediately. Thomas doesn't fully understand, but he nods anyway. Mitchell continues, let me explain it this way. If I told the Bureau of Ships that I want to redesign destroyer turbines to improve acceleration, they'd fund a 2-year research program. But if I tell them I want to substitute aluminum alloy for steel in 37 minor components using existing manufacturing capabilities, they'll say it's not worth the paperwork. But the second approach could be implemented in 6 weeks and achieve 80% of the performance gain. Thomas understands that. So what do you do? He asks. Mitchell taps the weight reduction study. I make a proposal that frames this differently. Instead of asking for permission to implement a comprehensive weight reduction program, I present it as a minor material substitution initiative that requires minimal oversight. I emphasize the speed of implementation and low cost. I bury the performance implications in the technical appendix where most administrators won't read carefully. Thomas grins. That sounds sneaky. Mitchell smiles slightly. That sounds like wartime bureaucracy, he corrects. Sometimes you have to work around the system to get things done quickly. Over the next 2 weeks, Mitchell works with Thomas after school, going through the weight reduction study component by component. They identify which parts can be modified most easily, which materials are readily available, which manufacturing facilities have capacity to make the changes. Thomas proves surprisingly useful. His young eyes catch details that Mitchell overlooks, and his questions force the engineer to explain and justify every decision, which strengthens the proposal. They narrow the list down to 41 components across 5 ship systems: propulsion, steering, pumping, ventilation, and weapons loading. The bearing clips are on the list, along with deck fasteners, valve housings, ammunition hoist brackets, and dozens of other small pieces that individually save only ounces, but collectively save 733 pounds per destroyer. Mitchell drafts a proposal titled Minor Materials Optimization for Current Production Vessels. He keeps the language dry and technical, emphasizing cost savings and manufacturing efficiency rather than performance improvements. The performance data is included, but presented as a secondary benefit. He submits the proposal to the Bureau of Ships on April 15, 1943, with a cover memo marked Routine Administrative Matter. 3 weeks pass with no response, which Mitchell considers a good sign. If the Bureau had rejected the proposal outright, he'd have heard immediately. Silence means it's working through the approval chain, being reviewed by mid-level administrators who don't consider it significant enough to flag for higher scrutiny. On May 7th, Mitchell receives a memo. Proposal approved for limited trial implementation on vessels currently under construction. Report results within 90 days. Mitchell shows the memo to Thomas that afternoon in Building 23. The boy reads it carefully, then looks up with wide eyes. They approved it? We're going to try it? Mitchell nods. on 6 destroyers currently being built at Philadelphia Norfolk Navy Yards, will implement the material substitutions, run sea trials, measure performance metrics, and if the results are positive, will expand to the entire destroyer fleet. Thomas feels a strange mixture of excitement and disbelief. His idea, his observation about bearing clips weighing too much, is actually going to be tested on real Navy ships. It doesn't seem possible. When do they start, he asks. Mitchell checks his notes. First substitutions begin next week, sea trials in late June. We should have preliminary data by mid-July. The implementation proceeds quietly, almost invisibly. Machinists in Building 17 and other workshops receive updated specifications for 41 components. The changes are minor, annotated simply as material substitution, same dimensions. Bernard Kowalski is among the machinists who receives new specs for the bearing clips. Instead of solid steel, he now machines them from hollow steel tubing. The work is actually easier because there's less material to remove. He doesn't think much about it, assumes it's some administrative decision to save on steel allocation. He doesn't know his son initiated the change. Thomas doesn't tell him. It feels strange to take credit for something that's now become part of official Navy production. Through May and early June, the modified destroyers take shape in the shipyards: USS Harridan, USS Newcomb, USS Bell, USS Burns, USS Izard, USS Paul Hamilton. 6 Fletcher-class destroyers built with hundreds of small weight reductions that nobody notices because each individual change is insignificant. The ships look identical to standard Fletchers. Same armament, same crew capacity, same overall specifications. The only difference is 733 pounds less weight distributed across dozens of components. On June 23rd, USS Harridan conducts sea trials in Delaware Bay. The morning is clear and cool, winds light from the southeast, ideal conditions for testing. Howard Mitchell is aboard with a team of observers, carrying stopwatches and clipboards, cameras to document the trials. They've set up measurement equipment throughout the ship, sensors to monitor vibration, temperature, stress loads on critical components. The test protocol is straightforward but precise. Measure engine response time from idle to maximum power. Measure acceleration from stationary to flank speed. Compare results against baseline data from standard Fletcher-class destroyers that have been tested under identical conditions. The data needs to be clean, reproducible, defensible against skeptics who will question every decimal point. The captain, Commander Robert Wilcox, stands on the bridge reviewing the test plan with his executive officer. He's a career Navy officer, 31 years old, grew up in Maine around boats, enlisted right out of high school, and worked his way up through the ranks. He served on destroyers in the Pacific Theater before being assigned to this new ship, saw combat at Guadalcanal, watched friends die when their destroyer took a torpedo amidships and broke apart in less than 3 minutes. He's skeptical of engineers who claim marginal improvements from minor modifications, has seen too many promising innovations fail when they encounter real-world conditions, salt water and storm seas and combat stress that test equipment beyond laboratory specifications. "Gentlemen," he says to Mitchell and his team, his voice carrying the flat authority of command, "I'll run your tests. I'll follow your protocol exactly. But I'm telling you now, and I want this on record, 700 pounds on a 2,000-ton destroyer isn't going to make a measurable difference. You're chasing decimal points, trying to prove theories that sound good on paper but won't survive contact with the ocean." Mitchell doesn't argue with the captain's assessment, knows there's no point in debating before the data comes in. He just asks for the tests to proceed according to schedule. The Harridan idles in calm water 3 miles off the Delaware coast, engines at minimum power, just enough steam to maintain station against the current. The crew is at general quarters, all stations manned, ready for immediate response. Mitchell checks his equipment one final time, confirms that all observers are synchronized, stopwatches calibrated, measurement protocols understood. He gives Wilcox a nod. "Ready when you are, Captain." Wilcox keys the intercom to the engine room. "Engine room, bridge. Prepare for flank speed on my mark." The response comes back immediately. "Engine room ready, sir." Wilcox counts down. 3, 2, 1, mark. He pushes the engine telegraph to flank speed. In the engine room, 4 decks below, turbine operators open steam valves, pressure flooding into the turbines, rotors beginning to accelerate. On the bridge, Mitchell clicks his stopwatch at the exact moment Wilcox moved the telegraph. The ship shudders slightly as propellers bite into water with increasing force, the deck plates transmitting vibration from the drive shafts. The destroyer begins to accelerate, water boiling white at the stern as the propellers churn. Mitchell watches the speed indicator climb steadily. 5 knots, 10, 15, the numbers increasing as the ship gathers momentum. 20 knots, 25, the acceleration smooth and powerful. At 30 knots, Mitchell stops his stopwatch, checks the reading 3 times to make sure he hasn't made an error. 83 seconds, he announces, his voice carefully neutral even though his heart is racing. Commander Wilcox blinks. "What was that?" 83 seconds from idle to 30 knots, Mitchell repeats. "The baseline for standard Fletcher class is 171 seconds. We just cut response time in half." There's silence on the bridge. Wilcox looks at his own stopwatch, which confirms Mitchell's number. "That's not possible," the commander says. 700 pounds can't account for that kind of improvement. Mitchell is equally stunned. He'd projected maybe a 10% improvement, perhaps 20 seconds faster response time. 88 seconds faster doesn't make sense with the weight reduction alone. Unless, he thinks, unless there's a secondary effect they didn't account for. He needs to run more tests. Over the next 2 hours, Harridan conducts repeated acceleration runs under various conditions. Every test shows the same result. Response times roughly half that of standard destroyers. Mitchell reviews his data frantically, trying to understand what's happening. Then one of his junior engineers, a young lieutenant named Douglas Chen, points out something in the technical specifications. "Sir," Chen says, "when we reduced weight in the drive shaft assembly and several pump systems, we didn't just reduce mass. We also reduced rotational inertia. The components spin up faster because they have less angular momentum to overcome." Mitchell feels his understanding click into place. Of course, weight reduction has 2 effects. It reduces the total mass the engine must accelerate, and it reduces the rotational resistance in spinning components. They'd calculated the first effect, but completely missed the second. The compound improvement is exponential, not linear. Mitchell requests immediate sea trials for the other 5 modified destroyers. Over the next week, Newcomb, Bell, Burns, Izard, and Paul Hamilton all demonstrate similar performance improvements. Response times between 79 and 86 seconds, compared to baseline times of 168 to 173 seconds. The data is consistent and undeniable. The modifications work far better than anyone predicted. On July 2nd, Mitchell submits his 90-day report to the Bureau of Ships. He includes detailed performance metrics, engineering analysis of the rotational inertia effect, and a recommendation for immediate fleet-wide implementation. The report is flagged as urgent and forwarded directly to Admiral Ernest King's office. King reviews the data with his Chief of Naval Operations. The implications are staggering. If the entire destroyer fleet can achieve these response times, anti-submarine warfare effectiveness will increase dramatically. U-boats depend on speed and stealth. If Allied destroyers can close pursuit gaps twice as fast, submarines lose their primary advantage. King authorizes immediate implementation across all destroyer production and retrofit of existing vessels during scheduled maintenance. Through July and August of 1943, Navy shipyards across the country receive updated specifications for the 41 modified components. The changes ripple through the supply chain. Aluminum alloy producers increase output. Steel mills adjust their allocations. Machinists retool for hollow components instead of solid. The transition happens quickly because the modifications are simple, no fundamental redesigns required, just material substitutions in existing manufacturing processes. By September, every new destroyer being built incorporates the weight reductions. Retrofit programs begin for vessels in port. The compound effect on Atlantic convoy operations becomes apparent within weeks. Destroyers respond to U-boat contacts faster. Close pursuit ranges more effectively deliver depth charge attacks before submarines can escape. The kill rate for U-boat engagements increases from 11% to 27%. German submarine commanders begin reporting that Allied destroyer response times have mysteriously improved, that tactics that previously worked no longer provide adequate escape windows. By October, U-boat losses in the North Atlantic increased to the point where Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of German submarine forces, withdraws wolf packs from the convoy routes and redeploys them to less defended areas. The strategic impact is profound. With U-boat pressure reduced, Allied convoy losses drop from 30% to 8%. Supply shipments to Britain stabilize, food rationing eases, ammunition stockpiles increase, fuel reserves rebuild. The British government cancels contingency plans for negotiated surrender. The war in the Atlantic shifts decisively in favor of the Allies, not because of a single dramatic breakthrough, but because destroyers can accelerate 88 seconds faster than before. In November, Admiral King convenes a meeting of senior naval engineers to understand how this improvement was achieved. Howard Mitchell presents the technical analysis, explaining the weight reduction program and the unexpected rotational inertia benefits. King listens carefully, then asks a direct question. Whose idea was this? Mitchell hesitates. The initial observation came from an unofficial source, sir, he says. A civilian who noticed that bearing clips were overspecified. I developed it into a formal proposal from there. King frowns. I want to know who that civilian is, he says. Recognition is important. Mitchell glances at his notes. Thomas Kowalski, sir. He's 12 years old. His father is a machinist at Philadelphia Navy Yard. The Admiral's expression is unreadable. Bring him to Washington, King says. 3 weeks later, Thomas Kowalski stands in Admiral King's office in the Navy Department building, wearing his best clothes, which are still shabby by Washington standards. His father stands beside him, equally uncomfortable. King is less intimidating in person than Thomas expected, just a tired, older man with the weight of a war on his shoulders. Son, King says, I understand you're responsible for an innovation that has saved a significant number of lives. Thomas doesn't know how to respond to that. I just noticed the clips were heavy, sir, he says quietly. King nods. Noticing things that others overlook is the essence of engineering, he says. You saw a problem that trained professionals missed because they were thinking too large. Sometimes the most important solutions are the smallest ones. He opens a drawer in his desk and removes a small wooden box. Inside is a medallion, bronze, with the Navy Department seal. This is a Civilian Meritorious Service Award, King says. It's not a military decoration because you're not military personnel, but it represents the Navy's gratitude for your contribution to the war effort. Official records indicate your observations led to modifications that improved destroyer response time by 51%, which directly contributed to reducing U-boat effectiveness in the Atlantic theater. Current estimates suggest these improvements have saved approximately 1,847 Allied sailors from death or capture. Thomas takes the medallion with shaking hands. He doesn't feel like he did anything worthy of this recognition. He just noticed some clips were heavier than necessary. But looking at Admiral King's tired, sincere expression, he understands that in wartime every advantage matters, every life saved counts, every second of improved response time translates to sailors who come home instead of drowning in cold Atlantic water. "Thank you, sir," Thomas says. King shakes his hand. "Thank you, son." The Navy needs people who pay attention to details, who question assumptions, who aren't satisfied with the way things have always been done. When you're old enough, I hope you'll consider a career in naval engineering. We could use minds like yours. Thomas nods, though he's not thinking about careers right now. He's thinking about his father, standing beside him with quiet pride. He's thinking about the machinists in Building 17 who implement specifications without questioning them. He's thinking about the destroyer crews who will never know that their ships accelerate faster because a 12-year-old kid noticed bearing clips were too heavy. The war continues for 2 more years, but the Battle of the Atlantic is effectively won by spring of 1944. U-boat losses mount, while Allied destroyer effectiveness continues to improve, not just from the weight reduction program, but from other innovations that build on the same principle of questioning established assumptions. The convoy system that nearly collapsed in early 1943 becomes a reliable supply line that sustains Allied operations in Europe. When the war ends in 1945, historians analyzing the Atlantic campaign identify multiple turning points: improved radar, better depth charges, long-range aircraft coverage, and the mysterious improvement in destroyer response times that appeared in mid-1943 and changed the tactical mathematics of submarine warfare. Few people know that improvement started with a skinny kid looking at bearing clips and thinking they were heavier than necessary. Thomas Kowalski grows up and becomes a naval architect, designs propulsion systems for the next generation of American warships. He never forgets the lesson he learned at 12 years old: that big problems sometimes have small solutions, that observation matters more than credentials, that questioning the weight of a bearing clip can change the course of history. In Philadelphia Navy Yard, Building 17 continues operating long after the war ends. Bernard Kowalski works there until retirement, machining components to precise specifications, teaching apprentices the craft of metalwork. He keeps his son's Civilian Meritorious Service Award on a shelf in the workshop. Doesn't talk about it much, but sometimes when new machinists ask about the medallion, he tells them the story. "My son noticed something," Bernard says. "Just a small thing, nothing dramatic. But small things matter in engineering. Every component, every ounce, every second of response time. You never know which detail will be the one that makes the difference." The young machinists nod politely, not fully understanding, but Bernard doesn't mind. Understanding comes with time and attention, the same way Thomas understood that bearing clips didn't need to be solid steel, the same way a quarter-inch reduction in material thickness could save 1,847 lives. The workshop machines continue their rhythmic noise, cutting and shaping metal into components that serve purposes both large and small. Each piece part of systems that depend on precision, reliability, and the careful attention of people who notice when things are heavier than they need to be.